Welcome everyone to another episode of Touch Type Share. Thanks for joining. We appreciate it. Today we're really excited. We have Ankush Gupta from Quizlet that's going to be talking about his KMP experience along with the organization's experience. So we're really excited to dive into that. We're going to start with introductions. Really quickly on Ankush, he's a staff software engineer at Quizlet, an online learning platform. He actually wrote the first line of code for the Quizlet Android app 7 years ago. And he's the one really leading the charge on the adoption of Kotlin multi-platform over at Quizlet. Fun fact, I learned this today, which is great. Ankush unofficially moonlights as a model. He serves as Quizlet's best performing subscription upsell image for 7 years in a row. We're gunning for 8 years next year. What we'll talk about today is going to be broken out into a couple pieces, but a spoiler alert is that KMP works. We're really excited to kind of hear from a team that has put this in production and has experienced the benefits of it. So while our focus at TouchLab is on native mobile, Quizlet is a great example of a company integrating KMP across Android, iOS, and the web. And they use KMP to power vital shared business logic that improves learning outcomes for their 50 million active users. Big scale, large impact. We're really excited to dive into some of the specifics of that story. We'll start off by talking about the background on Quizlet's KMP journey. Then we'll dive into how they are operationalizing KMP with their engineers and also with leadership. And then we'll talk about some of the benefits and results that are in place now and where kind of the organization is heading after they've had initial success with Kotlin multi-platform. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Ankush, Russell, and Kevin, and they'll be leading our conversation from here on out.
It's possible that you were one of the first in production, if not the. So, congrats, I guess.
Thank you.
You got to go through all the hard stuff. So we're going to start at the beginning and ask a question. So what led Quizlet to KMP, and what were the challenges the engineering org faced that led you to explore KMP?
At the time when, Kotlin multi-platform first came out, we weren't really, it wasn't like we were new to the idea of shared business logic. We were using shared JavaScript. So we were a web first company. We were writing a bunch of stuff on the web before we had mobile apps. And for a lot of our really complicated business logic, things like how do you grade a user's response? You don't want to do a normal string comparison because there's a lot of nuance in like how people type. There's special characters that are hard to type on a mobile phone versus if you are copying and pasting them. And so there's a lot of complicated logic that we had to write once on the web, and as we were writing it on Android and iOS, and as we were making it more complicated on the web and having to go back and make it more complicated on Android and iOS, with fewer engineers on those platforms, we kind of just got thinking, okay, how can we share this stuff and not have to do it multiple times? And so we had been using JavaScript through on Android. At some point, we were using web views. It wasn't really that stable to have like web views in the background. Different manufacturers had different stuff going on. We started bundling like the entire V8 JavaScript runtime compiled with like native code and wrapped with JNI on Android. That was really big, especially in the days. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, what was that adding to your binary size?
It was I think so. It was the days before we had split APKs, the days before we had Android app bundles, and I think it was responsible for like 50% of our entire app size was here is the JavaScript runtime. But we actually, Damien, former engineer at Quizlet, put together like a blog post comparing just the different, we considered a bunch of different options, and J2V8 was the only one that was performant enough, and it had this big downside of bundle size. But that it was working. We were using it on iOS. There's a little bit more easy to use wrappers for JavaScript because Apple maintains that for them. But we were using it and it was working, and it was powering some pretty important parts of the app. And eventually things just kind of got like worse and worse, and like crashes in the native JavaScript runtime were hard to debug when they did happen. Things like type safety was really tricky, especially when it's JavaScript, and it was before we were using TypeScript at Quizlet. So there were a lot of pieces that were just kind of not ideal. And on top of that, it was just brittle. Like we had to like it was a very manual process to get the new things in there into each of the native code bases and update them. And so at KotlinConf 2019, no, not 2019, KotlinConf, the first one, KotlinConf
The
number one,
2017.
2017, 17.
Okay.
Yeah. So at KotlinConf 2017, there is, Kotlin JS was a thing then, but Kotlin multi-platform wasn't until I think it was just announced there as like this is a thing that exists now. And we were like, hey, that seems really interesting. We're already sharing code. We were kind of at the breaking point on Android where we're like, are we gonna have to rewrite this again, just so that we can have stability? Like, it was it was like the biggest causes of our crash rate were all from like things in JavaScript that were hard to debug, and we were just like, it's hard to debug. I guess we just won't because we have to write more stuff.
Mhm.
And so it was like we were basically at the point where we're going to have to rewrite it into Kotlin anyway for the Android app. We were already, we were like as soon as we were already using Kotlin in the Android app, and we're like, okay, we're gonna have to rewrite this. I guess it's gonna be in Kotlin because that's what we're using now. And then, bam, Kotlin multi-platform is this big shiny thing that very experimental, but it was interesting at least because it's still kind of if it worked, if it fulfilled its promise, it would let us kind of have the best of both worlds. We have this shared code base. We are running it on web, on Android and iOS. We're writing it once, but with like real Android performance on Android, real iOS performance on iOS, and real JS performance in JS. So we took that back and we're like, hey, this seems kind of interesting, but just because something's interesting doesn't mean you can start using it.
That actually leads to the next question, which is like, what was your role? Which is essentially you have to propose this and sell it internally. So talk about that.
Yeah, no, it was fun. I think it was really cool because until that point, I was kind of thinking about all this stuff from the perspective of an Android engineer who has to there's this JS file that every now and then we have to update and change some stuff and then have crashes that we can't really figure out how to understand. But, the Android team wasn't the only team involved with that. There's web folks who are writing it. There's iOS folks on the other side. There's just from the leadership perspective, how does it work to, it's like, this is like a new thing we're adding. How does that fit in? So it's really fun to kind of understand things from the different perspectives so that, it's like I had my, from an Android engineer's perspective, what are the pros and cons, but then expanding that across the different slices. And I think the way that kind of worked is first, it's like you have to be sincere. It's not just hey, Kotlin multi-platform, I'm an Android engineer, we want this now. It's you have to actually try to understand, and you have to be open to being wrong. Maybe there's a very good reason Kotlin multi-platform doesn't fit. You should be and we did look at alternatives, what would React Native look like? What would at the time, I think Go had a way to compile down to JavaScript and you could get a native kind of thing and it would you could wrap it in JNI. It's what would that look like? And what are the pros and cons for those different approaches? And just being very clear that this is not necessarily the best thing this is just one of the things. And based on this list of pros and cons that we have considered, it seems to be the best, but maybe there's things that you haven't thought of yet.
What were the components of the initial KMP solution?
That's a great question. So right now, I think the initial proof of concept that we're hey, is this worth doing was our grader, which it's the external interface to it is pretty simple. You pass in a string and maybe a map of some settings for this is what the right answer is. This is what the user typed in. This is what the settings that are configured and some additional metadata they're primarily an English speaker studying Spanish. You probably want to grade that differently from a native Spanish speaker studying Spanish. But the internal machinery for that is a really complicated rule engine with it's pretty structured and pretty easy to kind of break down into components, but it was a kind of good way of figuring out what does the performance of this look like when we're evaluating a ton of regex expression, regex things. What does it look like when we have like a pretty deep stack, even if the interface is simple? And then like, what is the rough way that we need to call into that and interact with that from JS, from Android, from iOS? And like the API is simple enough that you can kind of see what it looks like, but it also gives you like a kind of foresight into, if we made this more complicated, what are the problems that can arise? And so the grader is one component. We have, like Shane, who's on this call, has a really cool blog post about like how we kind of try to model the user's knowledge state. Like, what do they know based on how they answered things previously, in a more smart way than just, hey, you know this, no, you don't know this. And how do we sequence the questions that we ask the user in a way that kind of propels them farther and farther along their learning journey? And that is super complicated code that now lives in Kotlin multi-platform. And there's a few other smaller components, things like we recently like launched a cool feature around just like progress, and like you're like exposing that to users, and that's in Kotlin multi-platform too. But all of the stuff that we currently have in Kotlin multi-platform doesn't have any kind of networking or persistence or concurrency, and there's no UI stuff. So right now we kind of limited it in scope to the same area that we were like, shared code at Quizlet is really powerful in these areas, the same areas where we're using JS. And now as the tooling is kind of improved, if we're exploring GraphQL, maybe Apollo Android, which is now Kotlin multi-platform, might be a cool thing to explore. Is something where, luckily, I think the order in which we did the Kotlin multi-platform stuff lined up with the order in which some things have matured a little bit more.
Looking back on your experience introducing this and using it in production now, and again, I think it's likely you're the longest and largest production deployment. What advice would you give teams seriously considering KMP? And then like, and we kind of touched on this, but if you're trying to sell it, for lack of a better word,
it works a lot better as a selling tool. If you have an Android app, if you have that, you always kind of have this escape hatch that you can open. It's like, oh, okay, well, if the alternative is writing it natively, by starting in KMP, we already have the Android part written natively, so you can always bail if need be. That's, I think, huge compared to things like Flutter and React Native. You're writing this code, and then if it doesn't pan out, you might have to just rewrite it. That isn't as big of a concern with KMP, which is, I think for us at least, it couldn't be understated. It was like, we're going to have to rewrite this in Kotlin anyway, was the status quo. And I think that's also really useful for just like, narrowing the scope of what you're working on. If you keep it like, what is the MVP to answer the biggest burning questions that we have right now? And then can we answer those as quickly as possible so that we can either all get in alignment that this is the right way to go if you have people who might not agree, or can, maybe we're wrong. Maybe KMP isn't the right tool for what you're trying to do at your company. And I think for us at Quizlet, it's been really cool to see, to see folks across different teams get to interact with it. Was a big win. I think even way back when it first started, it was significantly better than a lot of the alternatives out there, because JetBrains is primarily a tooling company, which is great for us. But yeah, then there's also a lot of just like, I don't know, there's a lot of stuff that just comes up, and then making sure that you're plugged into the right areas to like ask questions. There's enough people using it that you can probably ask a question and someone has hopefully done what you're trying to do before. And so that was a tough spot for us earlier.
I try to warn people. It's like, it's very likely that whatever you run into, you're the first person on the planet who's ever walked in that particular space. You brought up an interesting point, which is like, I'm trying to imagine someone pitching this in an environment that didn't have an Android client, which would be pretty hilarious. Although it wasn't a client and we have no agreement with them, but I also feel like I don't want to call people out. But we did talk to some large company that was like, their iOS team found KMP because they were deserializing some JSON and it was performing better than whatever they were using at the time, which I was All right, that's interesting.
Like, are there things things you're missing from Kotlin multi-platform now? Like things you either like the Japanese develop or like things you hope for from the future roadmap?
Definitely have a laundry list of it's like, I wish this existed. I think one of the more interesting things about how Quizlet is using Kotlin JS, like the JS portion of it, is we're building a JS library that we're consuming from a fully TypeScript app. It's not the kind of golden path story that JetBrains has, where you use Kotlin's, I think it's like Ducket is like Kotlin's, like you can read in TypeScript stuff and reference it from within Kotlin, is not how we're currently using multi-platform with JS. So there's a lot of just like things like, it would be nice if so with the new JS IR from Kotlin 1.4, it's like it has support for TypeScript exports, except there's a few things that are a little bit missing still, and it's experimental, so that's how it works. But like enums at Quizlet are a big deal. We have consistent enums across all of our platforms, across logging and everything. But in Kotlin, in Kotlin JS, an enum is represented as like a big blob. But in TypeScript, it's usually used like one. Like you use like the Kotlin equivalent would be like an inline enum, which doesn't exist in Kotlin JS. So that'd be cool. And it's also, Kotlin multi-platform, Kotlin JS has this thing called like a dead code eliminator, which if you're an Android developer, you're probably familiar with ProGuard. It's very similar to ProGuard in many ways, especially in like, you can accidentally burn yourself if you set it up wrong. But at least in ProGuard and Android, you can annotate things that like @keep, and ProGuard will keep them. In Kotlin JS, right now, at least you have to give it a long list of strings of things that you want to keep, which when you're consuming it externally, that's everything that's in your public interface. So I think that it's a little bit better tooling around that use case it would be ideal. And I think Ben Asher from PlanGrid had a really great blog post about iOS ergonomics. And I think that covers like anything and everything that we've run into with iOS on the iOS side. So JetBrains, please also do those things.
I think on the interface stuff, they do have some, like if you switch to the IR backend, there is like an explicit annotation for everything that's public, which I think will help with that.
I played around with it earlier in a preview, and it didn't exactly do that just yet.
Yeah, maybe
but
it's not in your use case.
Yeah, but also maybe it's probably a pretty simple Gradle plugin at that point to just find everything and pass in the fully qualified.
The question is, what do you think about the new declarative EUIs and planning refactoring? And because of that, I guess the question, because it's interesting, you are fairly unique in a situation where like most of what we're doing, and I think a lot of the early users of KMP will be native mobile, which obviously is going through a change in UI, but with the addition of the web, it's like you've got Compose, SwiftUI, and React or similars. So what do you think of these things?
So right now we're not really at the point where we're sharing even like I guess in an MVVM world, like the view model, we're still like a piece inside the view model is kind of what we have in Kotlin multi-platform at Quizlet. But I've done some playing around on the side, and I think there is a really cool project called People in Space. Yes, yeah.
John O'Reilly, what's up?
Yes.
Shout out.
But no, so like it's cool to see that, and I've been playing around with stuff based on like CampKit. I think CampKit is really cool. I think if we were to be trying to pitch Kotlin multi-platform at Quizlet today, it'd be a great place to start. So if you're trying to do that.
Yeah, I would agree. And the things like, so why is CampKit not SwiftUI and not Compose? And then part of it was like, well, we're trying to model what people would likely start with today. Although it's interesting, we talked to a potential client, unnamed, who they're going to do Compose and SwiftUI like now. And it's like a major client. I was like, wow, okay, the world is moving underneath my feet as we watch it.
Yeah, we're not too far from the point where people start making that transition for something that's not going to be live for a little while.
Talk to people about not doing shared UI, but the real nuance, but that's like a small soundbite. It's like it's not shared UI. It's not locked into shared UI.
Mhm.
So I could see a situation where if, there's obviously check-ins going to Compose for desktop, and then certainly um, at some point, whether it's going to be officially done or community done, somebody's going to try to do an iOS version of Compose. Like, it's going to happen. Whether we use it or not, I don't know. But like, I could see components of a UI being shared. Like, who knows?
Yeah.
But I think the whole industry across the board, whether it's collective like delusional madness or whether it's the new thing, is declarative UI is just like the thing, right? So it's coming, like, and people are going to do it. I don't think that changes that much with shared code, except for that's the funny thing, because people ask like, oh, does KMP work with MVI? I'm like, it depends on the library, but yeah, it's just code. It's just logic.
Yeah.
Like,
It's like if you can expose a view state and if you can bind a view state, it can work with anything if you wanted to. I think that's the cool thing too, is it's like you can put together a project and you can have different targets. Like you can share 99% of it, and then in one module not use Swift UI or Jetpack Compose, and in another module like do it the old-fashioned way and have like one project that has just the view rendering stuff for a bunch of different things.
Kush, do you have any like last words? What do you want? What do you think?
Last words. I think this might go against Kevin, what your opinions are, but I think at any point in time, like, be open that Kotlin multi-platform might not be the right tool for the job. Like, look at what it does well, look at what it does wrong.
And Kush, thank you so much for sharing. This was super valuable to us. Kevin, Russell, thank you as well. And please join us next week. We'll be talking about the library ecosystem, which is a nice continuation from this conversation. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. And have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you guys.
Bye.